All right. So first agenda, the person who didn't put their name on there, but apparently Kowei will be explaining his use case for.
Yeah, this is Nick Nellis. Sorry.
Okay.
I'll just kick it off, and then Quay's here to kind of talk about it. So, a continuation of about a month ago, Quay and his team are looking to migrate off of a multi-cluster custom Envoy control plane implementation onto Istio, and they have a pretty large deployment of Envoy service mesh. And the number one thing that's kind of preventing that from moving forward currently is this use case that they offer to their developers, which allows them to essentially choose the clusters that the applications fail over to, and it's a multi-stage priority ordering. And so I went back to them, and they're here today, so they'll talk about it. But essentially, the idea is that they need some sort of cluster ordering priority of endpoints. So this is kind of a multi-cluster situation. From the document that I wrote last time and presented, we largely kind of focus on like a node level thing, because Istio, kind of based on how we do endpoint ordering, it's a little bit easier to understand. But I brought them today and the real use case so we can talk about it. And then the goal is to hopefully come out with a plan forward on how we can start POCing or testing some implementation ideas, and so that they can look at migrating off of their custom control plane. So Quay here, if you want to kind of explain the cluster level failover priority, and then we can kind of talk about some solutions in Istio.
Sure. So hi, and we're from Indeed, and our use case right now is that at the global level, we have a failover order for all the application, by default. For example, for every application by default in this cluster, it can go from A to B to C. And there's also a we can also the service can also override it on a service level. Say for a particular service, then we can choose different ordering of failover. And even further, we can even set it up on a service to client pair level. So we can say for this particular service and client pair, we can even override that to this type of failover. So these are the main three scenarios currently we have at the moment. And the last time when we talked with I guess Solo, we did a POC, but I think we didn't join the meeting previously. But what we learned is that it seems like there is an existing mechanism in there, but it's essentially not practically usable for solving failover to more than 2 clusters or 2 criteria. So that's kind of why I think Nick put up this proposal and see if we can have some, I don't know, to see how we solve this problem together, if we could. Yeah, thank you.
And I think based on the last conversation, it appears that the way destination rule works today and the way it does selection would be sufficient for their use case in terms of selecting kind of those service to client pairs. I think there's 2 problems that exist today that we need to figure out. One is both versions of failover that exist in Istio don't allow the second and third tier failover order. It's more kind of on a programmable version based on where the client, kind of some of the client properties. So that's the one thing, is how do we represent kind of a multi-stage set of priorities? And the second problem, I think, is last time we talked about how we wanted, it'd be nice to standardize on labels on selecting your endpoints. Today, there is no standard label for cluster. And so how can we represent endpoints based on the cluster that they're represented by? And so I don't know if anyone has any ideas or opinions about how we could go about kind of solving those 2 problems.
You just want a label that represents the cluster?
Well, I think just based on the last conversation that we had, it'd be nice to have to use the standard like Kubernetes labels, but we just don't. There isn't one for cluster, so that we need to
No, we
obviously
have
create
those.
one.
We
Oh, we
already
do?
did what you want. So, yeah. So we add a couple. I'll send the link. We add a couple extra labels that you can select on that aren't actually labels on the pod, but they're kind of synthetic labels that you can match on. Zone, region, cluster, subzone, host name, and network are the ones we have currently. So you should be able to do that today.
Okay, so that addresses that one.
But it would be super useful if someone has sent a PR that is making that labels real, not virtual. I mean, in the injection pod, for example, or whatever is possible, because it will help interoperability and other systems that are not. Because this is actually something that Istio does internally. Not all of them can be done in injection. For example, cluster name can be put in injection, and few others can be.
Okay, because based on, since this is probably most likely a multi-cluster issue, most of this stuff will go into the service entry or workload entry, but I know that's getting reworked in the future as well.
Workload entry is only for VMs. For multi-cluster, please don't. I mean,
Right? Yeah. Today we still use it for multi-cluster routing, which is, I think there's a service entry RFC open to get away from that.
Service entry is long gone. I mean, for this use case, workload group and workload entry. I hope it's what you use. Okay, sorry, I'm kicked out.
Secondly, the way the API works for these kinds of failover is that we don't, from when A wants to failover to B, and then from B to C, I don't think you were able to actually specify the tier 2 and tier 3 failovers today. Is that correct?
Yeah, you can't do it like that.
And based on the locality, cluster is not used in locality load balancing at all, is it? I don't believe so.
That is correct.
Okay.
In the default, I mean, you can configure what you want to use, but the default doesn't include it.
Okay. How do you override that today?
The failover priorities field.
Okay. Sorry, I'm writing this down. And then so is there a way from the existing mechanisms to kind of add so the label's kind of been addressed from the multi-stage failover, would that kind of require a new API or an API change to have some sort of multi-level ordering?
I mean, I think if you were willing to manipulate the labels on your resources in some manner, you may be able to get away with doing it with the current API. I mean, if you have like a 3-tier hierarchy, that may not be so bad. If you have like 50, that's going to be probably unreasonable. I think you need a label per tier at the very least. I have to think it through.
Yeah, and I think that's what we arrived at originally. And based on, because up front, you don't know who's going to be doing what kind of ordering. It'd be really hard to specify, especially because producer and owner will be owned by different people, what those labels would be. Would you be in favor of us creating a new set of APIs in destination rule to support this custom priority failover?
Honestly, I think this is very complicated I'm a bit worried about. I mean, the use cases is basically like we can configure just completely arbitrary anything. It's going to be very hard to design a kind of reasonable, simple API around this, I feel like.
But if we
I mean, you want
to,
for every like service and client pair, we want our own override. Like this seems, pretty advanced.
I think that would work with the way so Indeed does a service per namespace approach today, and so I think destination rule would be sufficient for that kind of configuration.
I would push back against destination only in particular. I'm not saying it's not a good feature, but destination only is beta API that is broadly used. It's already pretty complicated and already has some problems. I think we have been very allergic to new CRDs, but we need to consider sometimes when it makes sense. I mean, instead of keep making destination rule more complicated and and also kind of any field we put there, it's very difficult for people to distinguish between things that are experimental and brand new and have probably a high cost and are not intended for beginners and the rest of the stuff. So if we can try this as a new CRD, I'll be much happier.
And so I think one of the proposals last time was a new like endpoint priority CRD, and then to move locality and failover priority.
We cannot move. I mean, again, things cannot be deprecated really in Istio because of falsification and everything else. But having a clean CRD that has those advanced cases that maybe are only supported by in some installation of Istio, because we also want to be able to turn off some of those more experimental costly features in some modes, like a safe mode that only uses the core features that people cannot mess up and can be supported by someone, and leave only advanced users with the fancy stuff. And expect some bike sharing, because again, slapping stuff on destination rule is easy, but if we want to create a new CRD that we want to have a better life than destination rule, we should probably do some extra research on how other servers are doing, because I expect this will also hopefully be adopted by other implementations, not only by Istio, part of Gateway, Gamma, and so forth, and it will be useful to have a proposal that is not Envoy only, Istio only.
Okay. So I think that would probably be our next step then, is to propose a mocked version of a new API standard. And then we'll just include our use case. And I think we can go from a discussion there.
And please include similar solutions in other servers. I mean, if you look at Gateway persistence proposal, for example, there is a long list of Nginx is doing that, AG Proxy is doing that. It's super useful when designing an API to know what other people are doing.
Okay. So I think that's my next steps. I don't know, Quay, is there anything more you'd like to understand before?
Jay or Jimbo, do you have anything else to add on to?
I didn't think so. I think all of the use cases were captured adequately.
Cool.
Yeah, I agree. I think our biggest struggle was the existing using this existing API that we have too many clusters, and we could potentially have like way more than 3 tiers of failover priority for some users.
One way, at least in our control plane that we've optimized it, we've only returned 2 layers of priority to the clients. So if you have like 8 priorities or whatever specified, we'll only return the first 2. So that, at least on our end, has helped reduce the control plane pressure.
Does that mean the other tier of priority are not going to be honored in your control plane implementation?
What do you mean?
Well, you mentioned that you only process the first 2 tiers. Maybe I didn't hear it correctly.
Oh, yeah. So our control plane also does active health checking. So when we detect that one layer is going out of failover or like not responding, we will then push the next priority. So yeah, we'll do a load and push the latest config.
Okay, got it. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Yeah, so if we go down to the path of having a dedicated customer resource, which could be priority failover or something like that, I assume that would enable you to configure it a mesh wide, and then you could potentially configure it on a namespace wide, right? Because you have like service level failover override. So that should satisfy the requirement.
As long as you can specify a destination as well, then I think it will. Because that would establish the client server pair.
And I assume your client and the server could be in different namespace too, right? So I guess then the customer CRD, does it have to reside? I assume it would have to reside either on the server namespace or the client namespace to be able to override.
Let's step back a bit. I mean, are we talking about ambient as well, or?
That's a good question. Yeah, I thought
Are
about
we talking
ambient.
Gamma?
Yeah, I mean, we were just thinking loud here on the customer Istio CRD that you were just mentioning, right? Because so Nick was thinking about destination rule as one proposal, but costing, I think you mentioned you prefer a customer CRD for this particular type of thing, right? So it doesn't kind of pollute the existing destination rule, which is super complicated already, right?
Yeah, but Lynn, you actually read my mind, and then you start to know what I'm thinking. I was thinking of this in context of Gamma and fixing the problems we have with customer overrides and all the craziness and compatibility with the Gamma. So and also ambient, making sure, because again, destination rule is very weird. I mean, it's client side. We have already problem with how we implement it in waypoints. So a new CRD would kind of open the path to have producer only.
Yeah, that's exactly why I was asking this question. Maybe it would be reasonable only allow to override on the producer side of the namespace.
Initially, at least, until Gamma Gateway and everyone have an ambient have an egress story, because right now, again, we still plan in a future version of ambient to have an egress path where we can control it on the client namespace. But we can start with a simple case and add it when we have the infrastructure on the other side. I don't want to add more gaps and between sidecars and ambient. Thank you, Liam, for making it explicit. I was too subtle for him, maybe.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. That sounds like we have a path forward then. So I'll probably come back in a couple of weeks with some more information on focusing on the new CRD and with some research about how others are doing it as well.
Yeah, I just added to the document. We did have a conversation around enhanced load balancing, I don't know, maybe a year ago. So I pasted the link to that RFC in the agenda there. If you want to give that a look.
Thank you.
All right. Is there anything else that we need to discuss on this topic? Okay, I take the silence as a no. Who's next? Does anyone else have any agenda to discuss today? Okay, I take that's a no. All right, then if there's nothing else, then let's call the meeting early and get half an hour back.
Yeah, thanks
Thank you, folks.
everybody.
Bye-bye.